In this video, I'm going to be talking about Guatemala, a country that is close and personal to me. As I explained in one video I made about my background, who I am a son of a Guatemalan immigrant. I am half Guatemalan. My dad came from Guatemala in the 1970s as a refugee from the civil war that was going on at that time. And the video I wanted to make is about the current crisis that is still going in Guatemala when it comes to out of control corruption. When it comes to corruption, Guatemala is not unique. Corruption is everywhere. Corruption is infamous in Latin America, and in particular, Central America and Mexico. It's rampant, and including in the United States, which I would call the godfather of pretty much all the corruption in the Americas. But I want to talk about Guatemala since, I still have a lot of family down there, and it does sadden me when I see the government of Guatemala is continuing to fight to protect corruption. And it makes me sad since I have a connection to that country. It's part of my blood. I have a lot of family there. So I want to talk about what's been going on there and bring more attention to it. And there is attention going on, and there is more actual news outlets, including in the United States, talking about it. But now it's my turn to talk about it. To summarize kind of what's going on is the current president of Guatemala, Alejandro Giammattei, and his attorney general, Consuelo Porras, have been harassing and firing anti-corruption investigators in Guatemala, as well as independent judges, and harassing them into leaving Guatemala altogether to protect corruption. And the reason that's happening is because in recent years, anti-corruption investigations were actually becoming so effective, they brought down at least two Guatemalan presidents, such as Otto Perez Molina, and those guys ended up going to jail for crimes like taking bribes, stealing from public funds, and other crimes. And so the corrupt elite in Guatemala are fighting back to save and protect corruption by any means. For those not familiar with the type of history Guatemala had, I'll explain it. Guatemala had a very bleak history, and during the 20th century, Guatemala was mostly run by brutal military dictators throughout the 20th century. And Guatemala went through a 36-year-long civil war from 1960 to 1996, a civil war between the Guatemalan military regime and insurgent groups who did not want any more military dictatorship. And over 200,000 Guatemalans were killed in a brutal civil war, and it lasted till 96. When the Civil War finally ended in 1996 and the country transitioned to civilian government, Guatemala's problems did not end there, and corruption still continued, and injustices from the Civil War continued. And then in 2007, something happened. In the end of 2006, the Guatemalan government ended up signing a treaty with the United Nations to create a independent body for investigating corruption called CICIG, which means the International Commission Against Impunity in Guatemala. So when this began in 2007, the Guatemalan attorney generals and prosecutors and investigators were getting help and support from this United Nations sponsored inter- in 2007, this anti-corruption project went into action, and it was quite successful. Guatemalan anti-corruption prosecutors and investigators were getting help and funding from the United Nations through this project, and were able to investigate war crimes and injustices done by Guatemalan military personnel during the Civil War, and Guatemalan corruption in politics with bribery and embezzlement. And during the 2010s, they made a lot of headway, bringing down at least two Guatemalan presidents, Alvaro Colom and Otto Perez Molina. Otto Perez Molina himself was a former general in the Guatemalan army until the year 2000, and has allegations he also did war crimes in Guatemala's civil war. So these anti-corruption investigations were quite successful and put at least two Guatemalan presidents in jail. One major figure in these anti-corruption crusade was Claudia Paz y Paz, who was the Attorney General of Guatemala from 2010 to 2014, and she successfully tried and investigated lots of civil war crimes in Guatemala that had been gotten away with for too long. So right when a lot of the progress was being made around 2015 is when President Jimmy Morales comes into the picture, who was a comedy actor in Guatemala who came to office after the downfall of Otto Perez Molina. And Jimmy Morales had a lot of contempt for these anti-corruption investigations because he and his family were being investigated by 2018. So at the beginning of 2019, President Jimmy Morales withdrew from the CICIG and made the prosecutors leave Guatemala that year, shutting down any more investigations. Jimmy Morales was continuing to try to protect corruption at any costs. And then after him, Alejandro Giammattei took office in 2020, and he and his Attorney General, Consuelo Porras, have been taking further aggressive steps in protecting corruption by firing people such as Juan Francisco Sandoval and other independent judges and anti-corruption prosecutors, and getting them to leave Guatemala to ensure that corruption will go on uninterrupted. And this is very sad. When I read a Human Rights Watch report about this crisis going on in Guatemala with corruption, it said since 2018, at least 22 judges and corruption prosecutors have left Guatemala and gone into exile, leaving Guatemala. President Alejandro Giammattei is a very corrupt leader and autocrat in Guatemala, doing these power grabs, putting yes men in charge after firing truly independent judges and prosecutors. And the U.S. is mostly backing him. Republicans in particular are very fond of Alejandro Giammattei because he is a conservative who is against communism and socialism. He's against abortion and puts on a very religious facade. And he's trying to cooperate with the United States when it comes to migration. So many Republican politicians in the United States and Republican groups like the Heritage Foundation are very fond of him and really do not care that he's extremely corrupt, which isn't surprising because, as I mentioned, the United States is the godfather of corruption, which includes a lot of these Republican senators. They are in on it too. They're just as corrupt. So no surprise there. So that is the sad situation that's going on right now in Guatemala, and it doesn't seem like there's really any signs that anything's going to get better there, and it's not going to help the migration situation when it comes to Guatemalan migrants coming to Mexico and the United States. And another video I'll be making is about who is there in Guatemala left that is trying to fight for change. I'll discuss that in another video. In the meantime, try to pay attention to what is going on in these countries.